Hello and welcome to Say Hi to the Future, Ingenious Thinkers, a podcast aimed at highlighting the human side of ingenuity. With me today is Marty Parker, CEO of Waterstone Human Capital, a culture-centric leadership advisory and human capital search firm that inspires organizations to build high-performance cultures.
Hi, Ken. How are you? Thanks for having me
Good.
on the show.
Well, welcome to you. As we were chatting, we know a lot of the same leaders in Canada and beyond, and it's wonderful to chat to chat live this time.
Sure is. It's great to be on, and you know, it's great to know a lot of the same people as well, because you end up figuring out that especially in a place like Canada where you have all these closer connections than we actually see, and of course, those are even more important now than ever since we've come out of our, the global pandemic.
So, Marty, leadership. I got to tell you, and this might be a little silly to say, but I'll say it. For me, the last great leader in the corporate world was Lee Iacocca. And I know I'm going back 40 odd years, but here's a guy who in 1979 went to the federal government in the US, got a federal loans package, and in return said that he would work for $1 a year. And I'll tell you why, to me, that is phenomenal leadership. I am so tired of hearing people go, I take full responsibility. And it means nothing. We saw with the financial crisis, going in front of Congress, who had made hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, saying, "Oh, I've been up all night trying to figure out what happened. More likely how I'm going to spend it, because that money wasn't coming back."
Right.
So, what is leadership? Have there been any greats in the last 40 years? Am I going
Oh,
back too far, Marty?
no, I don't know if you're going back too far. You can never go back too far when you're talking about great, right? I mean, um, there's no perfection, but great is great, and certainly Iacocca had some great traits in terms of a guy who championed, if I recall from my reading, things like innovation exceedingly well. He was one of those leaders that we first got to know that probably took Peter Drucker's theories to heart and engaged his and
Mhm.
involved his team members, exceedingly well and very actively. And he was also a great communicator and had great vision. So those are some of the great tenets of leadership. But I think there's lots of great leaders out there. I think unfortunately the current environment is tampered in some cases, maybe some of their natural abilities. I admire those who are brave. I was just reminded watching the Netflix series on Churchill at War. Just obviously a guy who at times was controversial. Obviously, he didn't get it right all the time, but would the Americans ever really have entered the war if it wasn't for his constant kind of communicating and persuasion of FDR? Of course, the bombing of Pearl Harbor brought them into Japan, but they didn't have to go to Europe. That's for sure. And that made a big difference to support us all, those British subjects who were already fighting. But, his communication skills, his vision, his belief of shaping history more than just responding to it, I think. And there's a lot of those kinds of things we can learn from today. But fortunately, in our business, we get to recognize and see through our Most Admired program that we may or may not talk about some of those exceptional leaders. And some of them are CEOs, but others aren't. They're just in other phenomenal leadership roles. Now, I think we also have a desire to be led, and that's not being fulfilled to some extent in some organizations and other institutions, let's call it, to the extent that we want to. So, I think there are great leaders amongst us, and there's just so much noise to be able to find them as well. And of course, then we have this idealistic view that they need to be all things, and no one leader is, which is why, all great things are accomplished not by individuals, but by teams. And so anyway, that would be my kind of big high level take on it, Ken.
Teams. I mean, this to me is where you go to culture. Your recent blog or one of your recent blogs, can better leaders and better cultures drive better productivity? If the leader is not the individual, but it's the global, if you will, within the organization, how do you fulfill that through culture? And maybe a corollary, fulfill it through culture in a hybrid world?
Well, that's absolutely dead on and right. I mean, it's really, really difficult. But look, let's just look at some facts. I mean, better leaders do drive better cultures, which do drive better outcomes. I mean, it's a fact. Now, let's also state another fact. You can have exceptional, I'm stepping over leaders here to the organization in a whole. You can have an exceptionally successful organization that doesn't have a great culture. You can have an absolutely terrific culture where employees enjoy it, love it, feel all the things they need to feel to do well, and the outcomes aren't there. So, I mean, what we're all striving for is that link between great organizational culture and high performance. But that link cannot occur, Ken, without what I would say great or better leaders, as we refer to, and better leaders, better culture, better results. The real question is, what is the makeup today and possibly tomorrow of those leaders? And then how can they align high performance? Because the recipe is different, in every organization, and ensuring that link is really focused on it. It can happen by accident, but it's rare. It's really rare because there are so many moving parts. And as we talked about on the onset here of this discussion, so much noise out there, be it via social media, through other channels that interrupt things for our team members. And as you mentioned, in a hybrid or virtual environment, it's just harder. I think we can clearly say those who are in fully virtual environments, it's hard to build, sustain, and drive results from your culture. It's the hardest. Those who are in hybrids probably have it the second most difficult. And those that are in person really have the best opportunity to do it. That doesn't mean that that's why you should have an in-person environment. I'm not a huge supporter of doing it for that reason and that reason alone. There are all sorts of other reasons. So I think it's a bit of a complicated link, but so the simpler we can make it, and better we understand our organizations and the kind of leaders who can support them, or maybe just maybe the kind of organizations we need to be within the leadership context that we have or want moving forward. So, but there's no doubt it's leadership and their behaviors that drive culture, which is the core behaviors that really represent an organization, and it's that culture that has the biggest impact on outcomes. And so by extension, leadership has that link to outcomes. And, I was just having a conversation with someone the other day who kind of tested me on leadership, described leadership. And I said, it's people leading people. It's not necessarily your senior management team, right? I mean, in lots of growing in middle market, we are now a middle and smaller middle market economy in Canada, whether we care to admit it or not. The numbers are the numbers. And if our middle management and people leading at the front lines, other people on the front lines aren't exceptionally aligned and don't exhibit those behaviors, it falls apart. So we often just say, let's get the senior leadership part right. Everything else will fall into place. That is absolutely not the fact. It takes enormous alignment, commitment, and really a systematic support and focus to ensure that leadership at large drives and supports the culture, which will drive outcomes.
So the word, as you talk through that, but the word that comes to mind for me today for any leader, but most importantly, the CEO, is clarity. As you said, there is noise everywhere. I have worked in innovation and ingenuity in larger larger organizations, coming in to support them. And they had what they believed to be a wonderful culture, and they've been shown to have a wonderful culture. They would support each other. They were performance driven, but there was lack of clarity. So they actually weren't moving in the right direction. And it seems to me that, that whole, and we, culture eats strategy for breakfast. I'm not sure I buy into that anymore. I think you strategically need to know where you're going. Vision, mission, clarity, guardrails, and then let your culture go crazy within that sort of confine, if you will.
Well, I agree with most of it, but not all of what you said.
Let me guess which one you don't.
Well, no, in fact, you are right. If you get those right, often the outcome of the culture will be good.
Mm-hmm.
But you are still leaving it to chance unless
Okay.
you do something about it, right? So you mean you can have the world's greatest, which, you've heard the other adage, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Yeah, not just alone. Peter Drucker said it earlier, or is said to have said it earlier, and he's not wrong, but not by itself, right?
Right.
For sure. Just like a great strategy. That alone,
Absolutely.
not great. Would you rather have better leaders or the right strategy? I think we all would say better leaders will figure out the strategy. But here is what I would say. Today, you were started by talking about the CEO, so we'll just start with that and extend it into leaders. If you are not an exceptional communicator in today's environment, I'm going to come back to that. Someone might say, oh, you have great gravitas. You have the ability to fashion your words. You are succinct. You're persuasive. You can emote well. All important, all good. But recency and frequency and clarity are the keys. You have to say things so much more often now. We've heard about this for years because of all the noise and all of the channels of communication. And it even escalates if you're fully hybrid or fully remote or hybrid. Okay. Then you have to have your entire team saying the exact same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next level, the exact same thing. And more importantly, you can say it, but you have to act it. And that's where the alignment of cultural enablers or systems, if we will, and the measurement, because you do get what you measure, right? You do get, if your number one value is to go out there and get business and you're in the business development role, and that's really what you focus on, you're probably going to be successful in however way you do it. But if there is a real clear alignment on leaders are there to, I believe, they have to have two core, there are two outcomes based on their behaviors. We can talk about what we think those behaviors need to be if you wish. It's followership and impact. And the impact doesn't come through your actual outcome connection. It comes through others. So if I don't have an impact on my team to drive results, then I'm having the wrong impact, if you will.
Right.
So getting back to it, the alignment and structure of behavioral, we call it culture now. That's what we've called it for 20 some years, but it's behavioral based initiatives to align, to make them very clear and simple, and to measure them. And to measure them, not to say, see, look what we're getting, but say, hey, this isn't working. So let me give you an example. If I'm speaking to an audience and I say to them, no matter, let's just say it's a business-oriented audience, reasonably senior, could be entrepreneurs, could be professional managers at the leadership kind of level. And I say, what are the two key measures of your human capital, or two or three? And the most common ones I'm going to hear: employee engagement. Okay. I'm going to hear net promoter, where I wouldn't have heard it 7, 8, 9 years ago as much, or right internally. So I might hear some culture measurements. But what I'm not hearing, and I'm not saying those are important, they are, but I'm not hearing things like increase in net income per employee, increase in revenue per employee. I'm not hearing some of those productivity measures. And so those measures may be good. Our net promoter is increasing. It's in a very relative to industry, general research. It's 50, a 40, a 65. Fantastic. Isn't that great? So people will say, you should come and work for us. I think that's good. Does that drive outcomes? It may, especially if you're scaling. It may, but it may not. And one of the issues why we're running at about 70% of the productivity of the United States these days is we are less focused on productivity measures. It's somewhat innate in many of their organizations. It's part of who they are, right, wrong, or indifferent. And we have been a little bit more focused on some other things. And I believe now that the soft skills are the hard skills. But if you don't measure them to what outcomes you want, then you're going to measure, if you're looking for great employee engagement, and you should have it, by the way, I'm not saying you shouldn't, you will probably really work hard to get there. The real question is, does that engagement drive outcomes? It may drive performance or productivity or other outcomes, but it may not. So getting back to the question, and why I'm trying to link it all in is, today, communication needs to be super repetitive, super simple, super clear, to your point, and concise. So in our case, right from internally to externally, for both sides of our business, retained executive search in Canada and the United States, and our culture and leadership advisory services, really focusing on how you use culture as competitive advantage, how to assess leaders, how to develop leaders. It's really simple. We're all about, our purpose is to inspire organizations to build high-performance leadership teams and cultures. And our real clear message is, as you picked up on, better leaders, better cultures, better results. So you have to be super clear. You got to start meetings with that. You got to look at measuring around that. You've got to ensure that everybody understands that and that it actually makes sense to your business. Of course, there's subtext and sub messages, but aligning that through, okay, are we developing our people to that end? What are we missing to that end? The problem is today we can get so all over the place, and it is really about clear, concise, repeat, and frequent communication.
So, Marty, I agree with what you're saying. One of the things, and I'll get back to Iacocca, that he thought every single leader needed to fully achieve was crisis. And we are in a crisis. And I'm not saying that I'm not saying that I buy into cutting the American civil service 80% in the next 10 days. You know, and I'm going a little far with the 10 days, we get it. The reality is our productivity, to me, is a result of the fact that we have not looked at the reality that it is time to fire and rehire, maybe even the same people, fire, retrain, and rehire. But we do not need as many people doing the same things as we had in the past. And there has to be some type of crisis mentality to how do we rebalance? And again, as I said, it might be rehiring the same people, completely reskilled in AI and coding and whatever it is, but enough is enough. We're just too heavy and we're very lethargic as a society, in my opinion.
Look, you and I are separated at birth on this issue. I fully agree, but I'm also quite optimistic. I'm not maybe leaning in right now saying it's all in place, we're ready to go. I think, and I'm not going to point to Ottawa or all the provincial capitals, say the vision has to come from them. I'm much more of a, I come from an Adam Smith school of thinking that, the invisible hand will correct things, but never waste a crisis either. So what I will say is this: when you are currently ranked 18th in GDP, and Ireland has the fastest growing GDP in the world, where 10 years ago they were 25th, I believe. Right. You absolutely have to admit you have a problem, first of all. And so I think that's important. We can talk about all the data and all that kind of stuff, but it goes right down to hours worked, productivity, et cetera. But let's look at the root causes. We can't just point at a social democracy and say, because we're a social democracy, that's not true. Social democracies in other areas of the world can work. And if you're a believer or not a believer, no matter what, the facts are they can work. So, and we are one, and it's not going to change overnight. So with that said, what do you do about it? First of all, well, one, you admit it. And two, you start to go with a vision in a new direction. And here are kind of some facts just kind of related to that. The facts are middle market economies don't invest in innovation. They don't invest in people at the same level. The reality is we have to invest more, and we have as small and medium-sized businesses. Not easy to do, but we do. Can governments help? Maybe, but we can't wait. So that's really important. I think the second thing is we need to start at home in our own businesses and organizations to say, what is our real purpose and where do we want to go? What's possible, whether we want to do it or not, but what's actually possible, And when we had the vision of, say, the first free trade, not the first, we had reciprocity many years ago, with other governments like the Laurier government. But and as a student in Canadian business history, those things do work. But we had a vision in the 1980s that said, let's start with free trade and have a vision of where we can go. And businesses responded. We were still a branch plant. We were coming out of that. But there's lots of business. Ours, 50% of our revenue comes out of the United States now. We're a proudly Canadian-owned and operated business. But we can compete and win in the United States. So first, you got to think about that. So you're renewing your vision. Secondly, you got to look at how you're going to invest. There's all sorts of areas you can invest now. AI for productivity, looking at new ways to measure, ensuring that you are investing in your people. But here is what happened that's kind of confused everybody. The pandemic came, and gosh, it was scary. This was scary stuff. It was either scary for your business. I know lots of businesses did this, but not initially. I know our business went to sleep. It was terribly frightening. Not to mention that we had our biggest Canada's Most Admired conference in Toronto on February the 28th, 2020. We signed a private equity deal to sell a minority of our business on the 29th. We were super excited to go. And then for the next 2 and 3 weeks as it unfolded, particularly that week that ended on Friday the 13th, I started thinking, did I just have a big super spreader with 1,200 people at it? And are people going to die like they did at the dental conference in Vancouver at other conferences? Wow. It was terrifying. Yet what happens after is your business goes to sleep. But what did we all do? We all tried to do the right thing and protect our people. We all tried to shelter them. We all tried to become better leaders and support them. And a lot of good things come out of it. But so do the bad things. The bad things are we become too protective. It becomes too much about our people. And for those of us who are parents, there's a lot we can learn from our parental errors and mistakes about, look, we have raised the smarter, more global, more interesting, dynamic generation. For those of us, I have kids in my 20s, but they got to decide the color of the room if they lived in a family, even in, in a middle income. They get to have impact on where they went on vacation. And as organizations, we've treated our people the same way. I'm not saying we're being too soft, but our focus has been on support, help, not as much on reskill, redevelop, re-entertain, which is what you're talking about. So we now, never waste a crisis. We got to shake ourselves out of it, make the investments, make sure we have people that are aligned to what we want, as opposed to saying, but I can't lose these people and maybe they're not aligned, right? So you talked about firing and rehiring or retraining and rehiring. You're dead on. And the reality is that that's in the name of our future success as a country, as businesses. And it's entirely possible because we've done it before, but we've just never come out of this kind of an environment, and an environment which is getting much better at how we treat our people, which is great. That's the great outcome. It just can't be all about that. Right. And so there's lots we can learn from each other. We think this ecosystem we have of Canada's Most Admired is a wonderful place to start. But that said, we got to get out of our comfortable chair and get on with doing the things we need to do to have profitable, sustained organizations over time. And we got to think a little bit bigger than just our smaller market, whether it's in our region, in our province, in what part of the country or the country at large. Whatever it is, we have to dream a little bit bigger. And I'm not sure we've done enough to talk about that, because without inspiration, it's hard to get people to follow.
Look, my work is all around thinking. It's all around human ingenuity and innovation. I have argued for decades now in rooms I've been in, some private, some public companies, some government. We are helping. Here, innovation is about helping people buy equipment and inventory. Those are the programs we've been seeing, not to think. And this came to a head for me. It was probably 10, 15 years ago. Called up. It was a program that had lent about $700,000 to a local company. They used it to buy inventory. The inventory is now obsolete. Can you help them? And I said, yeah. When you go bankrupt, think about your strategy and not about spending the money. That wasn't what they wanted to hear, but it was the truth. And in this country, we do not, in my opinion, we do not fund thinking. We fund acquisition. And you can't acquire before you know where you're going, what you're doing, why you're going there, and to your point, how you build the culture to support or lead, whatever word you choose. Okay. And I don't think we're any better today than decades ago.
Maybe worse. And here's the interesting thing. You ask young people, I'm talking people in their 20s, early in their career, and people who have a level of ambition and want more. That's really, they don't have to be like anybody else other than themselves. They have a much more global view because they've had the internet. forget about their education or development, no matter what it is. Most of them want better. They want a better life. The reality is they don't know how to get it. And that's the role of mentorship. That's the role of others. But if we don't know, if we're constantly walking around saying it's not possible and don't offer any alternatives, what are they going to hear? Right? And so this is not the work in leadership today. It's not the work. It's not easy work. It's harder work. I don't know if I was in my I don't know if I get the first leadership opportunity I got at the same way. I'm certainly very driven. I got, my big lesson, I call it Tale Two Cities in my book, The Culturepreneur, is, my first part of my career, both as a professional manager and then I came to entrepreneurship later, was about work harder, do more. I certainly had an open mind. I learned. I came from I had older siblings, and I learned from them. I was coachable. I was a college athlete. I listened. I knew less than I wanted to know, but it was my outcomes that got me that leadership. And then I got outcomes through others. So okay, I got impact. Did I get followership? Sometimes. Sometimes I didn't. But that's fine. Different era. Today it's different. Today you really need to connect with your team members. You need to take your leadership and make it a bespoke experience, a little different for the people who you're actually leading. It's hard to do. Now you're going to do it virtually or fully remote, let alone even in person. It's hard to do. It's tougher. It's not for the faint of heart. You talk about thinking. We have to train them differently. Not right. We have to teach them how to think. We have to teach. What Lee did was engage people more because they've been engaged growing up in their families. And now you ask them just to do it this way. Yes, sir, ma'am. No, sir, ma'am. 3 bags full, sir, ma'am. It doesn't work. And so I realized one day that my style wasn't working anymore. We had well-compensated, young, doing really well professionals, and some of them were leaving more than I wanted. And I thought, what's going on? What's wrong with these people? Remember when we all looked at Gen X and said, what is wrong with them? Guess what? It was me. I realized I was the constant, not them. I had to change. So I started studying what's working. And thankfully, I had our most admired program, right? Where I could create a little bit more psychological safety. I had to become a better communicator. People say, oh, you're a great communicator. No, I'm not. I'm not as frequent. I'm not as recent. I really have to rely on my team. Drive accountability in a way that also they felt meaning and connection to the purpose. I'm okay if someone leaves us because they don't align to our purpose. They could be great. That's great. But if they leave us and they are, we've got a problem. We made a mistake. We failed them and ourselves. And then you need to create an environment that enables them to and gives them the desire to keep thinking and learning. It's not just financial support. That's where culture matters, right? Are you doing it? What are you doing to upskill yourself, right? Are you open to feedback? Because they expect it to be a two-way street now, right? Not the way it was when, say, you and I came up through an organization. So the reality is leadership is way harder. And it's, on the whole, it's a slightly different behavioral profile than many of us who got there. We can still get there if we learn those skills, because it's a skill. It's not natural. But it's harder for a high D driver, right? Because they're more focused on outcomes than the process to get them or the people to get there. So you got to look at it differently. And it starts with also knowing yourself and self-awareness. So I think, you're right to be thinking about these problems. Are we thinking about these problems in our best institutions, our educational institutions? Some they are, I think, and some probably not as much. Are we really making the investments we need to? Are we working super hard to connect and understand individual meaning and purpose and to see if that can be aligned to our own? Yeah, I can tell you, it's tough. But I do know this. I do know if we stay focused on it. I'm 56. I hate to admit it, but I am. And, this next group coming in behind me, they'll be far better leaders. They'll be far more conscious. We just need to get them also focused on what we need to do to drive success in businesses. If those two things can come together, and they can, Ikoka, you brought him up. He's proven that it can, right?
Yep.
Lots of sports teams are great analogies when they really know their system or culture and who they are, and they stick to it. And they enable. It takes time. You don't get there right away. But then you see them get there. whether it's we're big and fast and a hockey team and we play a physical game like the Florida Panthers and they're all over you and you can't move. Look, it took them a bunch of years to get there, but they stuck to it, right? Whether it's a much more of a high transition game, offensive game like Tampa to Florida teams here, but they've won in most recent times. Let's go back to the New Jersey Devils who said, we have Martin Brodeur and we're going to create a super boring defensive structure and draft people and work them around the John Maddens of the world. And it worked. Let's talk about the West Coast offense and what San Francisco and college teams did before them and now is prevalent in the NFL, which changed the game and made the NFL more exciting. But it also created a lot of championships for them. Or New England, whether you want to talk about Inflategate or all the crap, highly competitive win at sometimes maybe possibly all costs, not inside the organization. Don't like that. But I'll tell you what I do like, team over individual, right? I do like that you kind of develop, you work into this Belichick New England Patriots culture. And you had kind of Bad Cop, who's an incredible coach, and an owner who was a super reward recognition kind of a guy. Did they have talent? Sure, but they changed that talent. You don't win 7 championships and get to 10 finals over a decade, over a period like that by fluke. So knowing who you are and aligning to it, it's possible. We can do it in the business world, but I'll tell you, we got to do it differently.
So I'm in conversation with Marty Parker, President and Chief Executive Officer of Waterstone Human Capital. You've mentioned your book, your 2021 book, Culturepreneur, a few times. When you talk about these offenses and these types of leadership and who you need to be, is the answer in Culturepreneur? Like what is a culturepreneur, and is the answer there?
Yeah, well, I think no one answer is in one book. No complete answer, I should say, is in one book. But yes, there are answers, and I think very healthy, productive, outcome-oriented ways of how you align culture and behavior to drive outcomes through leaders primarily. Yes, and it's empiric. It's not based on a notion, an ideology necessarily. And if it is ideological, it comes out of empirical evidence, which is both personal and all of the submissions, insights we get through our Canada's Most Admired Cultures, Most Admired CEO, and People Culture Awards, which is really an incredible R&D lab of info we get for over 20 years now that really kind of helps set us apart. But what it really is about, a culturepreneur is a leader that first knows themselves, that is an exceptional communicator for the things we talked about before, not just gravitas, not just a great orator, if you will. That it is, I think, we have to create physical and environmental and psychological safety. You have to do it in this day and age, and it's good business and important to do it. It just doesn't work if you don't, and it's not easy. Some people do it just by their style. Other people have to really work on it. Take this person to ensure that people feel safe, that they can share ideas and fail and not be penalized for just opinion. It's a big part of the inclusion, which is, I think, super important and good business. And then this combination between recognition, meaning, and accountability, this scale is super important. But learning how people want to be successful, go figure, but they really do. They don't want to be there just to feel good. Some do, but most don't. Most want to feel good and be successful because it makes them feel good. Happiness is a big driver. And so how do we do that while driving organizational outcomes? It's not impossible, but it's different in every case. And it often comes down to how we measure and how clear we are. You talked about clarity. I think you're really onto that. It's a simple thing to say, but hard to do. And then the whole environment of continuous learning, upskilling, training, knowledge is super key and needs to be a really important part of human capital strategy. And I would say this, we're kind of like, I'm going back to sports because it's one of the things I'm passionate about, but, Bill James 40 years ago in baseball, started writing this book called The Abstract, which is now, all sorts of data that has changed the game of baseball. Whether you like it or don't like it, pitcher starters not going more than 100 pitches or certain amount of innings based on a number of factors depending on the year, different stats at the plate, right, that people use. Some are just kind of interesting, some that really make a difference. For those of us who don't follow baseball, but read Michael Lewis's book Moneyball or saw the movie, we kind of understand it. Well, we're there now. It's happening from a human capital perspective. We're still a little too focused on, great place to work. And not as much on sustained peak performance. If you think of your organization very simply as a scale or a leader trying to balance things, if you have too much sustained peak performance, of course you're going to be known as a sweatshop. If you're this doesn't get talked about as much. If you're too heavy on great place to work, you're actually a country club. And so leaders should constantly, I'm never going to be perfectly balanced, but trying to figure out how it can stay almost imbalanced, even though it's not imbalanced.
Right.
You're tipping on one way or the other. We're still too far on great place to work. We're still too far. Great that we got there. We're too far. So what do we need to do right now in this cycle, in this future, to drive sustained peak performance? So culturepreneur or culturepreneurial leaders, which is a big part of the book, are really focused on those kind of things. And it starts by knowing themselves. But the culturepreneur operating system, which is more of how do you operationalize it, starts with that leadership, but then looks at a system of how you craft your call. Okay, here's where we are today. We've got to be realistic. Here's where we want to be. We can't now just say this want to be is our culture. It won't resonate with people. Maybe we have to add one or two things, and you do that through others, and you do that through changing leadership behaviors. But how do we go we have to craft where we want to be to drive our strategy. Culture isn't the strategy. It's to drive where you need to be. And so as you get there, you need to frequently measure the progress because people, especially today, the next era of leaders came up with participation medals and ribbons, right? And as bad as we may think it is, in fact, it isn't, because recognition is a good thing. But if we don't keep, this is a big challenge for me as a leader, recognition. If we don't keep in concert with it, how do we recognize people for their progress, not just the outcomes? If it's a lack of progress, we shouldn't be recognizing them. We should be telling them candidly, we're not there yet. But importantly, we don't know that unless we're really measuring the things that matter. And right now, the things that matter are more on sustained peak performance. So the operating system helps us get there because it has frequent measurements. It has the development of competencies that drive the culture that you want from where you are today. Not unlike if the best analogy I can think of is you go to Medisys or Medcan or your doctor and you get a medical. You now know where you are. Oops, I got high blood pressure. Oops, I need to do this. And then you formulate a plan. But if you don't follow that plan, if you don't bring in, coaches, if you don't measure it and see your progress or lack thereof, you may get there, but boy, oh boy, you're leaving it to chance. And so that's what an operating system is. It helps you get there in terms of the change and sustain behaviors to see if you're moving towards where you need to be to drive outcomes. Better leaders, better cultures, better results. That's the nature of the book, quite frankly. So it's really about, and frankly, you can build better leaders if they're open to it. Sometimes we don't have time. We got to find some. We got a gap where someone's not there. And that's also what you were talking about. And that's changed our game too, because we've got to spend a lot more time on looking at their behavioral events through their career, not just their patterns of success, important, but how they got there. And will that how actually translate into our organizational culture or not? Or do they have enough difference that it's going to, it might be a little rocky at first, but we need that. So that's really, really important and change the nature of how we work in our leadership search business.
Well, Marty, it's been a treat. We actually, if we're going with the baseball metaphors, we went through our third base coach's stop sign because we're good 10, 12 minutes past. But, I've just so enjoyed this that I wanted to keep going. And I just, just in closing, I wanted to pick up on something you just said about individuals, and we're not there yet. It's okay to celebrate, but do it within the confine, or not the confines, but in a performance sort of package. My late father was a phenomenal entrepreneur, and traditional manufacturing. We're going back decades and decades to, in manufacturing and in the Industrial Revolution, later phases of it. And when I moved from traditional entrepreneurship, which was manufacturing, real estate, to, something aligned to you, but it's better thinking, better outcomes, and research and all this stuff, he would always ask me, so how you doing? How's the business doing? And I would say for about 15 years while he was alive, we're getting there. We're getting there. He used to go out of his mind. What do you mean you're getting there? Did you do your ends? Do you do your ends? Do you know how you're doing?
Right. I'm getting a picture for what your dad was all about.
and I said, yeah, but that year is over. Now we're on to the next thing. And the funny thing about the next thing is I thought about it already. I'm on to the next natural, logical step.
Mhm.
And for me in my life, I think that a lot of leadership has been about that, not just clarity, but looking forward, engaging people um, within and on the same pathway. And having them work, there's no country club, but having work smart and hard. One thing that drives me absolutely insane is when people tell me work smart, and I go, great. You know what? I'm in the midst of finishing up my doctorate. I'm not a pretty reasonably smart person, but in 35 years of entrepreneurship, if you don't work hard, it ain't happening. So those are my sort of thoughts on leadership. And I don't know if there's something off of that you want to leave us with, Marty.
No, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, you can do all the things right and not have pace and intensity. And when you have a world, and it's certainly not, this is unfair for a whole bunch of people who really struggle, whether they're struggling mentally or whether they're struggling financially. I want to say that to start out. But when largely we become a society of being comfortable and encouraging. And everyone, you think of your children, your loved ones, you want them to be comfortable and happy. That's all we want, right? But reality is, comfort is the enemy of productivity.
Mm-hmm.
And it's in really good, successful times that we create bad habits for ourselves personally.
Mm-hmm.
Too much, we drink too much, we don't exercise enough, or in businesses. And so hard work is you can do a lot of things wrong and work really hard and be successful, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, look at the Pittsburgh Penguins. The Pittsburgh Penguins have this guy named Sidney Crosby. Anyone who's been on the ice with them in any practice goes, oh my God, I don't know how I'm going to make it here. Their practices are so intense. Well,
Right.
it's kind of Sidney Crosby. They have a coach that reflects Sidney Crosby. It's not the other way around. And the reality is, hard work beats talent when talent doesn't work hard. And so I really think you're right. But if you just keep telling people work harder, they're not going to align. If they find, this is true. I didn't like it when I first got my head around it, but if they find meaning in working hard, and let me tell you a way to find it. I just got an outcome. I earned more money. I got great recognition, right? So if they get something out of it early on and you keep rewarding them that way, but if you reward them, if you reward the complacency, if you reward the lack of outcome, and a reward can be status quo. This is where we started. So I think it's the place to end.
Yep.
This is where we need to change. And it's tough. It's tough because people are struggling today more in their heads than anywhere. And we're more aware of the mental health challenges that we're all dealing with. And as a result of that, we're all a little bit tentative. Can I push Ken to, how do I? So it's not really about pushing because I can't really push you, right? I can support you to get there, inspire you to get there, help you to get there, but I can't do it for you. Doing this doesn't matter other than getting you out there. So how do we do that? I think it's going to come down to finding that meaning, ensuring that we recognize, reward, communicate it better. And then it's a constant, relentless, not being afraid to make decisions. And this is frankly where I say, I'm so proud of being a Canadian, always will. I'll never give that up. Super passionate about it. But one of the things I really admire about the Americans is their ability to make decisions. And if they make a bad decision, they make another decision. And sometimes even if they make a good decision, they make another decision. They really move. They're more in their makeup. They're a lot more entrepreneurial. There's a lot of things I would not want to emulate, but there's some things we can learn from this and really employ because we can do it too. We have it in us and we see it in other ways. So maybe, just maybe, taking action, inspiring others to do it, not being afraid to make mistakes and say, boy, we blew it there. But if you blew it by taking the risk, if you blew it by doing it, trying, so what? That's just one step closer to getting there, even though it hurts like heck. So I just think we got a lot more work to do on that front, and I'm really buoyed and inspired by the fact that you're saying, hey, it starts here, and we have to start with action between our ears before we can take actual physical action. And I think you're right, especially in a knowledge information based economy. We should be worried less about AI and worried and more focused on the internal intelligence, II, and then use that AI to kind of support us. So thank you for having me on. I really enjoyed it, and wish you all the best.
Thanks, Marty Parker, President and Chief Executive Officer of Waterstone Human Capital. And to you, thank you for joining us on Ingenious Thinkers today.
Thanks, Ken.